And how long was it from when you first heard hip hop until when you first started like making? Well, I know you made the pause tape beats. You know, when did that actually start?
Uh, okay, so I guess when I first started making beats was way after. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was a DJ. I started off as a DJ, and I was a DJ for the longest, and I would say really until I got to college, and started hanging around. I went to SUNY Westbury, which is a college in Long Island. And the thing about the college, very interesting thing was when I was coming in as a freshman, Kumo D was a senior, I believe, at the time. Okay. He was at the school, and so was DLB from the Fearless Four. I didn't know them. They were older, and I think they actually were older guys even in school at the time. Like they guys that went back to school. But I'm a 17-year-old kid coming in to school, and I was hanging around with my crew. One of the people that I was hanging out with was Diamond D. Okay. Diamond D went to SUNY Westbury. A lot of people he doesn't talk about that much, but he went to Westbury as well, and we used to hang out a lot. Between him and seeing him DJing, because I had stopped DJing for a little while, him DJing and kind of got me back into hip hop, and the people that I was seeing on campus got me back into hip hop because it sounded more like what I had heard on those tapes. A lot of the records, even some of the Run DMC stuff, to me, all great stuff, but it didn't have the raw appeal of that stuff from the tapes. When I started hearing the stuff that Diamond D was working on, and getting introduced to some of the radio stations that were playing hip hop. Yeah, this is around the time when KRS-One, BDP started learning about That's the Public Enemy. That brought me back in to hip hop because this felt like what I knew, the angst, the energy. It just felt good, and I kind of skipped over something. When I was in high school, I was in a heavy metal band, so I went from DJing, into when I got to high school playing drums in a heavy metal band, and that really connected me to raw stuff. I like the raw music. Yeah. That's what it was. So like groups like Metallica, Slayer, this was the stuff I was checking out in high school. So when I heard Public Enemy, Boogie Down Productions, that to me felt like the angst of the heavy almost metal like stuff.
Heavy metal, for hip hop.
yeah. So it connected me back to my hip hop roots that I kind of broke away from. And that was so your question. So that really got me back into the idea of hip hop, and I made my first beat. I remember what it was. It was a pause tape beat. Went back to the pause tape of Sister Sanctified Break. And I combined that with Proclamation of the Wicked, which was a rock band called Celtic Frost. So I blended those together. That was my first beat. I was somewhere around 18 years old when I did that.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, and talking about the, like making your first beat and everything, after you stopped using pause tapes, what was like the first drum machine or like production equipment that you started producing tracks on?
I went to a school called the Institute of Audio Research, and this was after college. And when I finished my coursework there, I got an Alesis, some kind of sequence. I can't think of the name of it. It was a really small.
Was it basically like a keyboard, like a controller almost?
It was a keyboard sequencer is what it was. It was like a HR-16, something, that kind of name. I had a Casio keyboard that was MIDI controlled, and then I had a Kai SO1 sampler, which was really a keyboard sampler. It wasn't meant for any long-term sampling. I had I think 11 seconds total in the whole machine, and it had 8 banks of samples. So you were restricted to a certain number of sample per bank. So, you know, it was real. I was speeding samples, records up to make them fit. Like everything was.
Yeah.
That was my first. The sequencer was sloppy, so it wasn't tight. Like my beats weren't really locking in properly, but it allowed me to get my ideas out. You know, so that was my first setup. You know, but really at that particular time, I was working on just getting the ideas down. So when I went to the studio, I had like the scratch pad. You know, so when I went to the studio, I was using, I think they had Cakewalk, the SP1200, you know, like those kind of things they had going on. So I was able to use the professional stuff in the studio, but at home, that was my setup, kind of like a consumer kind of setup.
Yeah. Kind of like make a makeshift type thing in a way.
It was.
And it gave you good practice for when you went to the studio.
Absolutely. Yeah, I loved it, man. You know, it really, the only thing that I was lacking was the ability to tighten up the drums. And I was able to, when I got my 1200, that was when I learned how to get my drums tight, you know, once I got the 1200.
When you say tighten up your drums, what was it that the Alesis and the, you know, the Casio was lacking as far as when you did your drum programming?
You know, it was the way the sequencer had very minimal ways to kind of lock in onto a grid. You know how we lock into a grid today?
Right.
With this particular, whatever, it was almost like working unquantized, but the quantizing that it had in there would shift it to these exact numbers that didn't have a real scientific way of locking the beat. So if I was off on one snare, off on one kick, that was it. There was no way to really change it.
It would throw the whole thing off.
Right. Yeah, and it felt, now interestingly enough, no one ever heard it as being sloppy, and people like today, because of things like Jay Dilla, people who introduced the idea of unquantized music, they probably would have heard it and been like, yeah, you were doing that stuff before, because it felt kind of that slop groove, you know, is what a lot of the beats were at that time that I was working on. But it wasn't what I was going for.
Yeah, at the time you didn't like it because you wanted it to be locked in.
Locked in, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting how things can shift, you know, in different,
absolutely.
different eras and stuff, and people come out and innovate things, you know.